Imagine a man sitting in a small, windowless, highly sterilized room. He is sweating, like profusely. His hand is trembling, hovering just inches above a switch on a massive, intimidating metal machine. And echoing through the thin drywall separating him from the next room are the agonizing, guttural screams of another human being.
Yeah.
A man who is begging, pleading, literally throwing himself against the wall to be let out. And the man at the machine, he hesitates. He looks over his shoulder. Standing right behind him is a stern figure in a crisp gray technician's lab coat, just holding a clipboard.
Right.
And this figure in the lab coat looks at the sweating man, completely unfazed by the screaming, and says in a perfectly flat, polite voice, "The experiment requires you to continue."
It is a scene that feels engineered for a psychological thriller, right? The tension in that laboratory is just suffocating.
Oh, absolutely.
The man at the console is clearly in deep, visceral distress. His entire body language, the shaking, the hesitation, those desperate glances backward, it's all screaming that what he's doing is fundamentally wrong. He does not want to press that switch.
No. And the crazy part is, the authority figure doesn't pull out a weapon. There's no physical threat. There's no blackmail.
Yeah.
There is just a polite, firm, bureaucratic directive. You have no other choice. You must go on. So I want you, the listener, to put yourself in that metal chair for a second. Just strip away the ego and think about it honestly. How far would you go? How much excruciating pain would you inflict on a total stranger if a calm authority figure simply told you that stopping wasn't an option?
We all cast ourselves as the hero of our own moral narrative, We watch movies, we read history books, and we tell ourselves that in that room under those fluorescent lights, we would be the one to stand up, push the chair back, look the scientist in the eye and say, "No, I won't do it."
Right, because we're the good guys. But today, we're opening up an incredibly dense stack of psychological literature that suggests our internal moral compass is, well, it's much more fragile than we care to admit. We are exploring a chilling core thesis across decades of research.
And it's a dark one.
It really is. The thesis is that the greatest threat to morality isn't sadism, it isn't some inherent cartoonish villainy, it is obedience.
Yeah.
So we're doing a deep dive into the infamous 1963 Stanley Milgram obedience experiment, and we are pulling from Milgram's original disturbing findings, modern archival research that honestly actually tries to tear his legacy apart, and contemporary replications to figure out how human compliance actually works.
Right. The world was still processing the raw, incomprehensible trauma of the Second World War. But more specifically, the global consciousness was trying to reckon with the Holocaust, the sheer industrial scale of it. It wasn't just violence, it was, paperwork, schedules, logistics.
Bureaucracy.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Bureaucracy. And there was a very specific gnawing question haunting philosophers and sociologists at the time.
And it really all came to a boiling point in 1961, right during the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann was one of the primary logistical architects of the Holocaust. He coordinated the trains.
Right.
And when he was put in a glass booth and put on trial for the entire world to watch, everyone expected a monster. They expected a foaming-at-the-mouth psychopath.
But he wasn't.
No. His primary defense, and the defense adopted by thousands of others in the aftermath of the war, was terrifyingly mundane. He basically said, "I was a bureaucrat. I was just following orders."
And the public reaction to that defense was absolute horror mixed with aggressive denial. It just seemed impossible. How could millions of accomplices, the train conductors, the clerks processing the paperwork, the soldiers on the ground, how could they have just been following orders?
It's a terrifying thought.
It is. So the prevailing psychological theory at the time, particularly in the United States, was heavily reliant on the idea of a German character flaw. The American public and many academics desperately wanted to believe that German culture, with its deep roots in Prussian militarism, strict discipline, rigid social hierarchies, that it had a unique, localized vulnerability to destructive authority.
There's a profound psychological comfort in that idea, isn't there? Like, if the capacity for that kind of systemic violence is isolated to a specific nationality or a specific culture, then the rest of the world is safe.
We can just distance ourselves.
Yeah. We
Yeah.
can point a finger across the ocean and say, they have a problem, we don't.
And that was the exact comfort. Stanley Milgram, who was a young, ambitious psychologist at Yale University, that's what he wanted to test scientifically. Milgram was of Jewish descent himself, and he was deeply unsettled by the Eichmann trial.
Right.
So he hypothesized that the German character was indeed uniquely obedient. His methodology was essentially to design a rigid test of obedience, run it on everyday Americans in New Haven, Connecticut, just to establish a baseline of normal rebellious behavior, and then take the entire study to Germany to measure the contrast.
He fully expected the American subjects to tell the experimenter to take a hike. Americans pride themselves on being individualistic, democratic, fundamentally anti-authoritarian. He just needed the data to prove that normal people wouldn't shock a stranger, so he could then fly to Europe and prove how uniquely compliant the Germans were.
Yep.
But Milgram never bought that plane ticket.
He never had to. The American baseline results were so catastrophically high, the participants were so incredibly compliant with the instruction to inflict agonizing pain, that the entire cross-cultural comparison was just abandoned. Wow. He didn't need to cross the Atlantic to find blind obedience to destructive authority. He found it in the local postal workers and high school teachers of New Haven.
I look at this like running a stress test on a building's foundation. You set up this massive pressure rig expecting a very specific type of concrete, let's say, German concrete to crack because you think it was mixed poorly. You apply the pressure to your control group just to calibrate the machine, and suddenly the entire building collapses.
That's a great way to put it.
You realize it's not the concrete. The laws of physics make every building vulnerable if you apply the pressure in the exact right spot. The vulnerability wasn't national, it was entirely universal. But let me push back on the prevailing narrative for a second, because the word evil dominates the conversation around Milgram.
Sure.
Is it possible he wasn't testing evil at all? Like, when you look at evolutionary biology, we only survive as a species because we learned to cooperate, form hierarchies, and follow leadership. Was Milgram just accidentally testing our biological instinct for social cohesion?
You've hit on the exact misunderstanding that plagues this study. Labeling the participants as evil is intellectually lazy and misses the terrifying reality of what the data actually shows. You are entirely correct about the evolutionary aspect. The survival of early human tribes depended absolutely on social cohesion.
Right. If everyone argues, you die.
Exactly. If every individual constantly questioned the leadership when a predator approached, the tribe would be wiped out. Obedience is a pro-social survival mechanism. What Milgram unwittingly built was a machine that hijacked that deeply ingrained, necessary instinct for cooperation and pointed it directly toward a destructive end.
Yeah.
He wasn't measuring malice. He was measuring the vulnerability of our desire to be good, cooperative members of a group.
So how do you build a trap for the human conscience? How do you weaponize cooperation? Let's walk through the mechanics of the shock machine setup, because it is agonizingly clever.
It really is. The entire experiment was essentially a meticulously choreographed piece of theater. The initial sample consisted of 40 men from the New Haven area, ranging in age from 20 to 50. This was a deliberately diverse cross-section of the population. You had laborers who hadn't finished elementary school, right alongside engineers and professionals with doctorate degrees.
And they were recruited through simple newspaper ads, offering $4.50 to participate in a study on memory and learning. Now, $4.50 in 1961 is roughly equivalent to maybe $45 or $50 today.
Not bad for an hour's work.
Right. It's a nice bit of pocket money, but importantly, the researchers handed them the cash the moment they walked through the door. They were explicitly told, this money is yours for showing up no matter what happens in the lab. They completely removed financial coercion from the equation. Nobody was shocking a stranger because they needed to pay rent.
Which is a brilliant experimental control.
Yeah.
So when a participant arrived at the very impressive, very intimidating Yale Interaction Laboratory, they were introduced to two other people. The first was the experimenter. This role was played by a 31-year-old high school biology teacher named Mr. Williams.
Okay.
He was instructed to be utterly impassive. He wore a gray technician's coat and maintained an aura of stern, emotionless scientific authority.
The uniform is doing so much heavy lifting there. The gray coat is the visual shorthand for undisputed knowledge.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the second person in the room appeared to be another volunteer just like them. This was a 47-year-old, mild-mannered, slightly overweight accountant named Mr. Wallace. He was incredibly likable, very average. But Mr. Wallace was actually a Confederate, an actor secretly working for Milgram.
Then comes the rigged draw. The experimenter explains that the study is looking at the effects of punishment on human memory. One person will be the teacher asking questions and administering punishment. The other will be the learner trying to memorize word pairs and receiving the punishment. They draw slips of paper from a hat to assign the roles, but the draw is fixed. Both slips of paper say teacher. Mr. Wallace, the actor, opens his, smiles, and says, I'm the learner. This ensures the real, unsuspecting participant is always seated in the teacher's chair.
And the psychological manipulation begins the moment the roles are assigned. The teacher is asked to watch as Mr. Wallace is taken into a small adjacent room. He is seated and strapped into an apparatus that undeniably resembles an electric chair.
This is awful.
The experimenter methodically straps his arms down, explaining in a very clinical tone that this is to prevent excessive movement when the shocks are delivered. And then he applies a thick electrode paste to Mr. Wallace's wrists. He announces very loudly that this paste is necessary to avoid blisters and burns.
That detail with the paste is so visceral. It completely grounds the theatrical setup in a terrifying physical reality for the participant.
Yeah.
If you are the teacher watching this, you aren't thinking about a memory test anymore. You are thinking blisters, burns. What kind of voltage are we actually dealing with?
Which brings the teacher back out to the main room, where they are seated in front of the shock generator itself. Milgram knew that if the machine looked fake, the entire experiment would collapse. So he had it custom built to look incredibly industrial and authentic. It featured a horizontal row of 30 lever switches. They started at 15 volts on the far left and escalated in tiny 15-volt increments all the way to 450 volts on the far right.
And the labels printed above those switches are practically designed to induce anxiety.
Oh, totally. They were grouped into specific designations. The far left started innocuously enough with slight shock. As you moved right, the labels escalated to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and danger, severe shock.
Keys.
Finally, the last two switches on the board at 435 and 450 volts bypass words entirely. They are simply labeled with a red XXX.
XX. Pure, unspecified, fatal danger. And to absolutely cement the illusion, before the test even starts, the experimenter takes the teacher's wrist and gives them a real 45-volt test shock from the machine.
Just to prove it works.
Exactly. It stings. It's a genuine jolt of electricity. At that exact moment, any lingering doubt the participant might have had evaporates. They believe, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the machine they are operating delivers real, painful electricity.
And the task itself is mind-numbingly simple. The teacher reads a list of word pairs into a microphone. Then, they read the first word along with 4 multiple-choice options. The learner, strapped in the chair next door, presses a button to indicate their answer, which lights up on the teacher's console.
Okay.
If the answer is correct, they move on. If the answer is incorrect, the teacher is instructed to announce the current voltage level, press the corresponding switch to deliver the punishment, and then crucially move one switch to the right for the next mistake. The voltage must go up by 15 volts for every single wrong answer.
Let's walk through this escalation slowly, because the way the suspense builds in that room is methodical psychological torture. The learner, the actor next door, is operating on a set, predetermined script. There are no actual shocks being delivered, but the teacher has no idea, so the test begins. A few minor mistakes are made. The teacher presses 15 volts, then 30 volts, then 45. At 75 volts, the teacher hears the first reaction through the wall, a distinct, audible grunt of discomfort.
And at this point, the participant almost always pauses. They look over their shoulder at the experimenter, seeking guidance, but the experimenter simply nods and says, "Please continue." So they do. As the mistakes continue to mount, the voltage climbs. By 120 volts, the grunts from the next room have escalated into loud verbal protests. Mr. Wallace is shouting, "Hey, this really hurts."
Then we hit 150 volts, which becomes an incredibly critical threshold in the data. At 150 volts, the learner starts yelling, and he introduces a new variable. He complains about a heart condition. He yells through the wall that his heart is starting to bother him. He explicitly refuses to go on and demands to be unstrapped and let out of the room.
This is the moment where the social contract of the experiment violently fractures. Almost every single participant turns away from the machine, looks directly at the experimenter in the gray coat, and verbalizes their distress. They say he wants to stop, or "You heard him, he has a heart condition, I'm not doing this."
Right.
They're actively looking for an off-ramp. They're looking for the adult in the room, the authority figure, to step in, take control, and stop the suffering.
But the authority figure does not step in. This is where Milgram's infamous prods come into play. The experimenter was armed with a script of 4 specific escalating prompts, always delivered in that same calm, flat, polite tone. If the teacher hesitated, the experimenter used prod 1, "Please continue," or "Please go on."
Right. And if the participant continued to argue or refused to press the switch, the experimenter escalated to prod 2. The experiment requires you to continue.
If the teacher still fought back, citing the man's heart condition or the screaming prod 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue.
And if they still outright refused, the final, chilling directive, Prod 4, you have no other choice, you must go on.
You have no other choice. Imagine the psychological weight of that statement being delivered by a stone-faced scientist at Yale University. So what happens? The teacher turns back to the board. The voltage keeps climbing. 165, 195, 240. The screams are no longer just protests, they're agonizing shrieks. At 300 volts, the learner isn't just screaming, he is desperately pounding his fists against the drywall separating the two rooms. The teacher can hear the physical thumping vibrating through the wall.
And at this point, the learner completely stops answering the questions.
Yeah.
The lights on the teacher's console go dark. The teacher turns to the experimenter, usually in a state of absolute panic. He's not answering. I can't shock him if he doesn't answer. And the experimenter calmly instructs, treat the absence of a response as a wrong answer. Wait 5 to 10 seconds, state the voltage, and deliver the shock.
It forces the participant into this inescapable bureaucratic loop of violence. And then, at 330 volts, dead silence. No pounding on the wall, no screams, nothing. Just an eerie, terrifying quiet emanating from the other side of the drywall.
The implication to the person sitting at the shock generator is crystal clear. The learner has either passed out from the excruciating pain, suffered a massive cardiac event, or worse.
And the experimenter, standing right behind them, simply says, no response is a wrong answer, please continue. So, listener, here is the climax of the setup. Before Milgram actually ran this experiment, he polled experts. He asked seasoned psychiatrists, psychology graduate students, and esteemed colleagues to look at the experimental design and predict the outcome. He asked them, what percentage of normal, everyday people do you think will go all the way to the 450-volt XXX switch, delivering a potentially lethal shock to a silent, non-responsive man?
The consensus among the psychiatric professionals was nearly unanimous. They predicted that only a deeply pathological fringe of society, about 0.1% or 0.1% of the population, would administer the maximum shock. They firmly believed that once the learner started actively protesting, or at the absolute latest, once he stopped responding entirely, the vast majority of human beings would let their empathy override the instructions and refuse to continue.
I want you to lock in a number in your head right now. Think about the postal clerks, the teachers, the guys working at the local hardware store. What percentage of them do you think actually went all the way to 450 volts?
The actual result was staggering, and it sent shockwaves through the scientific community. 65% of the participants, nearly two-thirds of the men in the baseline study, administered the maximum 450-volt shock. And perhaps even more disturbing, 100% of the participants went to at least 300 volts. Every single person in the baseline study continued to shock Mr. Wallace to the point where he was physically pounding on the wall in agony.
Two-thirds. 65% of normal people pushed a button they thought might kill a man. Just wow. When people hear that statistic for the first time, the immediate reflexive response is defensive. They think, well, those 65% must have been monsters. Milgram must have accidentally recruited a bunch of hidden psychopaths who secretly enjoyed having the power to torture someone.
And it is the most common misconception about the entire experiment, and it is a myth that the empirical data aggressively refutes. We have to dispel the idea of sadism right here. These participants were not enjoying a single second of this. The physical and emotional reactions observed by Milgram and his team through the one-way mirror were profound, agonizing, and deeply disturbing.
This wasn't some gleeful, mustache-twirling villainy. These men were falling apart in that chair.
They were sweating so profusely it soaked through their shirts. They were trembling, stuttering uncontrollably, and biting their lips so hard they bled. Observers noted several subjects digging their fingernails into their own flesh to cope with the stress. 14 of the 40 subjects exhibited highly inappropriate, convulsive nervous laughter, which is a classic psychological defense mechanism when the brain encounters unbearable, irreconcilable tension.
It's just their brain short-circuiting.
Exactly. One participant, described as a confident, successful businessman when he walked in, was reduced within 20 minutes to a twitching, stuttering wreck, and actually suffered a full-blown, uncontrollable physical seizure in the chair from the sheer psychological terror of the situation.
They were completely, utterly tormented by what they were doing. Every single participant questioned the procedure. Most of them actively pleaded with the experimenter to stop. They offered to give back the $4.50. They argued, they begged, they said, I can't do this anymore, you have to let him out. And yet, despite their own bodies physically rebelling against the violence, their hands kept moving to the next switch. They were trapped. Why couldn't they just stand up and walk out?
That specific question led Milgram to develop what he called agency theory. He proposed that in complex social structures, human beings operate in one of two distinct cognitive states. The first is the autonomous state. This is how we navigate most of our daily lives. In the autonomous state, we direct our own actions, we are guided by our internal moral compass, and crucially, we take full personal responsibility for the consequences of our behavior.
If I bump into someone on the street and drop their coffee, I feel guilt because my autonomous self caused the accident.
Exactly. But, Milgram argued, when we are integrated into a hierarchy and confronted by an authority figure whom we perceive to be legitimate, we can undergo a profound psychological shift into the agentic state. In this state, we cease to view ourselves as independent actors. Instead, we mentally redefine ourselves as mere instruments or agents for carrying out the wishes of the authority figure above us.
I think about this like driving a car with a highly advanced experimental autopilot system. When you are driving manually, you are in the autonomous state. If you crash, it's your fault. But when you engage the autopilot, you enter the agentic state. You are sitting in the driver's seat. You can see the car veering toward a cliff. You are terrified of the cliff. But you have cognitively transferred the responsibility of driving to the software. Even as the car goes over the edge, you are telling yourself, the software did this, not me. You have outsourced your moral culpability to the system.
That's spot on. And to build on that analogy, it's not just that you think the software is driving. In the agentic state, the core requirement for staying in the car is the explicit belief that the software or the authority figure will take the blame for the crash. During the experiments, when the tension reached a boiling point, participants would often stop and demand of the experimenter, who is responsible if he gets hurt? Who takes the blame if he has a heart attack?
They needed to know.
They desperately needed to know. And the experimenter was trained to reply, I am responsible. The university is responsible. The moment that verbal assurance was given, observers would literally see the physical tension drain out of the participants' shoulders. They would turn back to the machine and continue pressing the switches. They successfully abandoned their autonomy because someone else agreed to carry the moral weight.
But Milgram didn't just stop at that baseline study. He knew that just proving obedience existed wasn't enough. He needed to understand the specific dials and levels that controlled it. He wanted to know how to manipulate the agentic state. Over the next several years, he ran 18 different variations of the experiment, tweaking specific variables to see what broke the obedience and what amplified it. And these variations are where the true, terrifying mechanics of human compliance are laid bare. Let's look at the first major mechanism, incremental commitment, or the foot-in-the-door technique.
The structure of the chalkboard is paramount here. The experiment did not begin with the experimenter handing the participant a 450-volt switch and saying, electrocute this man. If that had been the initial request, obedience would have likely been 0. Instead, the machine escalated in tiny, almost imperceptible 15-volt increments.
It's a cognitive trap. Because if you've already rationalized giving a 15-volt shock, why is 30 volts suddenly a moral failing? It's just a little bit more. And if you've given 195 volts, why not 210?
Exactly. The gradual nature of the task makes it logically impossible for the human brain to find a definitive objective stopping point. Every time the participant tries to draw a moral line in the sand, the authority figure's very presence essentially asks, well, you just delivered 150 volts, and you decided that was morally acceptable. Why is 165 volts suddenly a bridge too far? The participant's own past behavior is weaponized against them to justify the next incremental step into darkness.
Next, let's look at institutional authority. The baseline study was conducted at Yale University, which is a massive bastion of scientific prestige. Participants walked into those Gothic buildings assuming that such a revered, elite institution wouldn't possibly allow anything truly unethical or dangerous to happen. So Milgram tested this. He ran a variation where he moved the entire operation out of Yale and into a rundown, slightly seedy commercial office building in downtown Bridgeport, Connecticut. He stripped away the Ivy League branding and claimed the study was being run by a vague, private entity called Research Associates of Bridgeport. What happened?
The obedience rate dropped significantly. Without the halo effect of Yale University, the number of people willing to administer the maximum 450 volts fell from 65% down to 47.5%. The illusion of profound institutional legitimacy was weakened, allowing more participants to snap back into their autonomous state. Furthermore, Milgram tested the visual cues of authority. In one variation, the stern experimenter in the gray lab coat is called away from the room to answer a phone call. An ordinary member of the public, which was just another actor wearing regular street clothes, takes over, giving the orders.
So you completely remove the uniform. You remove the visual shorthand for "I am a scientist."
Right. And when the exact same commands were delivered by a man in everyday clothes, obedience absolutely plummeted to just 20%.
That is wild. Think about what that means. The gray piece of fabric itself commanded 45% of the obedience in that room. It reveals how heavily we rely on superficial visual cues, a badge, a suit, a lab coat to decide who we allow to dictate our morals. Okay, what about the diffusion of responsibility? Because this is where the numbers get truly horrifying.
This was tested in what Milgram called the two-teacher condition. In this setup, the real participant was not required to physically press the shock switches. They were assigned the role of simply reading the word pairs into the microphone. A second confederate, an actor pretending to be another volunteer, was the one tasked with actually pushing the levers to deliver the shocks.
So the participant is insulated from the violence. They are one step removed from the physical act of causing pain.
Yes, and when you remove the physical motor action of pressing the button, the cognitive dissonance practically vanishes. In this variation, the obedience rate skyrocketed to a staggering 92.5%. Almost every single person went all the way to 450 volts. The compartmentalization allowed them to easily rationalize their behavior. They could tell themselves, I didn't hurt him, I didn't push the button, I was just reading the words on the page. The other guy's the one doing the shocking.
The implications of that 92.5% figure for large bureaucracies or military chains of command are devastating. When tasks are compartmentalized across a massive organization, no single person feels the weight of pulling the trigger. The clerk managing the supply chain for a war feels just as innocent as the participant reading the words, even if their paperwork directly enables mass casualties. The system is designed to diffuse the guilt so thinly that nobody feels it.
Which logically brings us to the inverse mechanism, proximity. What happens when you strip away that insulation and force the participant to physically confront the victim? In the touch proximity condition, Milgram brought the learner out of the isolated room and seated him directly next to the teacher. Furthermore, when they reached 150 volts, the learner dramatically refused to place his hand on the metal shock plate. The experimenter then ordered the teacher to physically grab the learner's arm and forcibly hold his hand down onto the shock plate while administering the voltage.
That completely shatters the sterile illusion. You are no longer just pushing a button on a control panel. You are feeling the heat of another human being struggling against your physical grip.
And the data reflects that visceral reality. When forced to physically enact the violence, obedience dropped down to 30%. They could no longer hide behind the machinery. Interestingly, proximity to the authority figure proved just as crucial as proximity to the victim. In another variation, the experimenter gave the initial instructions and then physically left the room, delivering all subsequent orders over a telephone.
So the authority figure is out of sight.
Yeah. When the experimenter was not physically looming over their shoulder, obedience fell to 20.5%. But the most fascinating part of the telephone variation is what the participants did instead of obeying.
Yes, this detail from the archival sources is incredible. When the experimenter was on the phone, many of the participants actively lied. They would press the 15-volt switch, which barely registered, but they would confidently tell the experimenter on the phone that they were pressing the 300-volt switch. They were still too intimidated by the hierarchy to openly, verbally defy the scientist, so they resorted to quiet sabotage. They faked compliance.
It perfectly illustrates how much the physical, localized presence of the authority figure enforces the agentic state. Finally, the most effective tool for breaking obedience entirely was the introduction of contradictory authorities. In this variation, two experimenters in gray coats were placed in the room. At the critical 150-volt mark, they began a scripted, heated argument. One experimenter firmly stated, "We must continue," while the other argued back, "No, we should stop. The learner is clearly in pain."
It's like watching mom and dad fight. When the gods disagree, the mortal is suddenly free to make their own choice.
Exactly. The illusion of a unified, infallible, legitimate authority was completely shattered. When faced with two conflicting commands from equal authorities, the participants' agentic state collapsed. Obedience dropped to absolute 0%. Not a single participant went to 450 volts.
So when we look at all these variations, the traditional narrative for decades has been that people are sheep, we are deeply flawed, we blindly obey, we just follow the loudest voice in the room. But I always struggle with this idea of blind obedience. It makes people sound like unthinking robots, which we know isn't true. And the sources highlight some modern scholarship by psychologists Alexander Haslam and Stephen Reicher that completely flips this traditional narrative on its head. They propose something called engaged followership theory. What exactly are they arguing?
Well, Haslam and Reicher argue that blind obedience is a massive oversimplification that ignores the psychology of the participants. They spent years analyzing Milgram's archival data, specifically listening to the original audio recordings of the sessions. They realized that the participants didn't just turn their brains off and blindly submit to dominance. Rather, they actively identified with what they perceived to be a noble, vital cause, which was the advancement of science. They didn't view themselves as obeying a dictator. They believed they were collaborating with a brilliant researcher to unlock the secrets of human learning, which could eventually benefit society.
Right. And the proof of this theory is hidden in how the participants reacted to the specific prods.
Precisely. This is the paradigm shift. The prods that appeal to the cause of the research, like Prod 2, the experiment requires you to continue, were highly effective. They reminded the participant of the noble goal. However, the direct, coercive order, Prod 4, you have no other choice, you must go on, was actually a terrible tool for gaining compliance. When participants were hit with that final authoritarian command, many of them snapped out of their compliance, argued back, yes, I do have a choice, and quit on the spot.
That is a terrifying nuance. They didn't want to be slaves to an arbitrary order, but they did want to be good, helpful partners to the scientific mission. So they were willing to do monstrous things as long as they could frame it in their own minds as a necessary, difficult sacrifice for a greater good.
It suggests that the most dangerous, destructive obedience isn't driven by a cowering fear of a tyrant. It is driven by a misplaced, toxic sense of virtue. When people truly believe they are serving a righteous cause, whether it's scientific progress, national security, or a corporate mission statement, they can cognitively justify almost any atrocity.
But if they believed they were serving the noble cause of science, we have to look at what that science actually looked like in the room. Because when you pull back the curtain on Milgram's pristine laboratory, the reality wasn't noble at all. It was incredibly messy, highly coercive, and it sparked one of the biggest industry-altering ethical firestorms in the history of modern psychology.
Oh, the fallout from this experiment was monumental, and rightly so. By any modern standard of research, Milgram's methodology is viewed as profoundly unethical. The participants were subjected to extreme deception regarding the true nature of this study. Because of that deception, they were entirely denied informed consent. I mean, you cannot agree to the parameters of an experiment if the researcher is lying to you about what the experiment actually is. And most critically, they were subjected to severe acute psychological trauma.
A very prominent psychologist at the time, Diana Baumrind, fiercely criticized Milgram in the academic press. She argued that he had inflicted unacceptable, potentially permanent stress on his subjects. She raised concerns about the long-term damage to their self-esteem, their trust in authority, and their ability to live with the knowledge that they were capable of lethal violence.
Milgram defended himself vigorously against these charges. He leaned heavily on post-experiment surveys sent to the participants, claiming that 83.7% of them reported being glad or very glad to have participated. He argued that the subjects had learned a profound, important truth about human nature and themselves, and that the acute distress they experienced in the chair was temporary. In his view, the monumental scientific value of understanding obedience justified the temporary deception.
But this is where the modern archival research really starts dismantling Milgram's polished narrative. An Australian psychologist and researcher named Gina Perry spent years meticulously digging through Milgram's personal archives at Yale. She listened to hundreds of hours of original, unedited audio tapes and read through his unpublished private notes. And what she found offers a devastating rebuttal to the idea that this was a pristine, standardized scientific environment.
Perry, alongside other critical researchers like Stephen Gibson, discovered that the supposedly standardized procedure was, in reality, incredibly chaotic and manipulated. For instance, the experimenter, Mr. Williams, was supposed to stick strictly to the 4 polite prods. But the audio tapes reveal he frequently went completely off script. Instead of just calmly prompting the subjects, he would improvise. He would cajole, argue, and heavily coerce participants, sometimes engaging in prolonged aggressive debates with them to force them back to the chalkboard.
Which completely undermines the core thesis. If the experimenter is essentially bullying and badgering the subject off script for 5 minutes, that is no longer a test of polite bureaucratic authority. That is just psychological attrition. And Perry noted this aggressive coercion was especially prevalent when the subjects were women, which adds a whole different layer of power dynamics to the data.
Furthermore, Perry uncovered evidence that Milgram selectively hid data that contradicted his primary thesis. He ran several variations of the experiment that he never published in his major papers because they simply didn't fit his preferred narrative of inescapable, inevitable obedience. The most striking and damning example of this is what is known in the archives as the relationship condition.
The relationship condition completely changes how I view this entire study. We have to spend time on this. What exactly did he do in this variation?
So in 1962, Milgram ran a setup where the participants were required to bring a close friend, a neighbor, or a relative with them to the lab. The roles were still rigged, but this time, the real participant was acting as the teacher, and their actual friend or family member was strapped into the learner's chair.
So you aren't shocking a stranger. You are asked to shock your buddy or your brother who is screaming your name through the wall. And what happened?
The results inverted entirely. In the relationship condition, there was an 85% disobedience rate. The vast majority of people flat out refused to continue when they had a personal connection to the victim. The empathy for a known loved one easily overpowered the authority of the Yale scientist, but Milgram buried this finding. He never published it in his seminal book on the topic because it undercut his dramatic, headline-grabbing conclusion about the absolute terrifying power of authority.
That is a staggering ethical failure for a scientist. He cherry-picked the data that made for the most sensational story. And on top of hiding data, Perry also found that contrary to Milgram's public claims about participant well-being, many of the subjects were not properly debriefed immediately after the experiment ended.
That is perhaps the darkest archival revelation. While some were introduced to the unharmed Mr. Wallace right away, many others were simply allowed to leave the laboratory believing they had genuinely harmed or even killed a man. They went home to their families carrying that immense psychological burden, and they didn't find out the entire thing was a theatrical hoax until they received a generic mailed report from Yale months later. The unmitigated trauma they endured in that intervening time is ethically unjustifiable.
And it is precisely because of the fallout from Milgram's work alongside a few other notorious studies from that era, like the Stanford prison experiment, that modern institutional review boards, or IRBs, were created. If you are a psychology researcher today, you cannot run an experiment on human beings without an independent committee rigorously auditing your methodology. They ensure that informed consent is prioritized, that no lasting psychological harm occurs, and that if deception is absolutely necessary for the science, immediate and thorough debriefing is mandatory.
But acknowledging the flaws, the ethical breaches, and the buried data raises an incredibly difficult question. Despite the messy methodology, are the core findings about human compliance still valid? If we could somehow run a perfectly ethical version of this stress test today in our modern culture, would it happen again?
The terrifying answer from the scientific community is yes, it absolutely would. Because over the decades, researchers have found highly creative ethical ways to replicate the essence of the study, and the numbers have barely budged.
The most famous and rigorous modern replication was conducted by psychologist Jerry Berger in 2009. Berger had to navigate the strict IRB rules, so he designed an ethical workaround. He ran the exact same Milgram setup, but he mandated a hard stop for the experiment at 150 volts. He chose 150 volts because, in Milgram's original data, that was the statistical point of no return. Once participants crossed the 150-volt threshold, the exact moment, the learner complains of a heart condition and demands to be released. 79% of those who pressed the next switch went all the way to 450 volts.
Wait, hold on. Let me challenge that methodology because it feels like a massive leap. Berger stopped the experiment at 150 volts, which is basically a strong sting. How can we possibly equate a participant willing to give a 150-volt shock with someone willing to go all the way to 450 volt, knowing they might kill the guy? Isn't it incredibly presumptuous to just extrapolate that data and say, yeah, they probably would have kept going? It's a fair criticism, and it's one Berger had to defend rigorously. He wasn't guessing. He was relying on the psychological principle of behavioral momentum. The data shows that the cognitive dissonance required to cross the 150-volt line, ignoring a direct plea for medical help from the victim, is the hardest psychological barrier to break. Once a subject rationalizes crossing that specific moral boundary, the subsequent 15-volt increments become infinitely easier to justify. They have already committed to the transgression. And based on that statistical model, in 2009, Berger found that 70% of his participants were perfectly willing to continue past 150 volts. The underlying rates of obedience hadn't dropped a single percentage point in nearly half a century.
And we don't even have to rely on laboratory extrapolations to see this in action. We see it in real-world professional environments. Think about the famous Hoffling nurses study from 1966. Think about the last time a superior at work told you to do something that felt a little off. Maybe a manager asked you to cut a corner on a safety check or fudge a number on a report. Now imagine the stakes are literally life and death. In the Hoffling study, a researcher called 22 different hospital nurses while they were actively on shift on the ward. He identified himself over the phone as a doctor they had never met, going by the name Dr. Smith.
And Dr. Smith ordered the nurses over the phone to immediately administer 20 milligrams of a fictitious drug called Astrofen to a specific patient on their floor.
And the researchers had planted the Astrofen bottles in the medicine cabinets beforehand. The label on the bottle explicitly and clearly stated that the maximum safe daily dose was 10 milligrams. So this unknown, disembodied voice on the telephone is ordering these highly trained professionals to administer a lethal double dose of an unauthorized drug to a patient.
The results were chilling. 21 out of the 22 nurses complied without hesitation. They prepared the lethal dose and had to be physically intercepted at the door of the patient's room by a hidden observer. The ingrained hierarchical power of a doctor's authority completely overrode their years of medical training, the hospital's strict protocols, and the clear printed warning on the bottle in their hands.
And if you were sitting there thinking, well, that's just an American problem or a product of the 1960s medical hierarchy, the data continues to prove otherwise. In 2010, a French reality TV show called The Game of Death disguised a Milgram replication as a glamorous game show. They had a cheering studio audience, flashing lights, and a highly authoritative, charismatic TV host pushing the contestants to shock a screaming man in a box for failing to answer trivia questions. 80% of the contestants went to the maximum voltage on national television. And more recently, in 2015, researchers in Poland replicated the paradigm with modern subjects and found an astonishing 90% obedience rate.
The behavioral mechanism is incredibly robust. Across decades, across cultures, and across different professional environments, human beings are deeply biologically wired to comply with authority. This is especially true when that authority provides a plausible justification or appeals to a higher culturally valued cause, whether that cause is scientific progress, medical hierarchy, or even just the rules of a television entertainment program.
But let's clarify something crucial before we wrap up, because we have to address the historical shadow hanging over this entire topic. Milgram famously and repeatedly linked his findings back to the Holocaust. He basically pointed to the 65% obedience rate and said, look, this explains the Nazis, this is how Eichmann happened. But historians, sociologists, and modern psychologists have heavily nuanced this comparison over the years.
Yes, scholars like James Waller and Ian Nicholson strongly argue that the Milgram experiment does not perfectly map to the realities of genocide. While the experiment is brilliant at isolating the variable of obedience, there are fundamental, critical differences in the context. In Milgram's lab, the participants were constantly assured by a trusted Yale scientist that while the shocks were painful, there would be no permanent tissue damage. They inherently believed they were participating in a benevolent system that was helping science, not committing murder.
Right.
Contrast that sterile laboratory environment with the reality of real-world atrocities. The perpetrators of genocide know exactly what they're doing. They understand they are extinguishing human life. Their actions are not just driven by polite orders from a guy in a lab coat. They're driven by years of deep ideological hatred, pervasive state propaganda, intense racial dehumanization, and often the threat of severe lethal punishment if they disobey the regime. Milgram's subjects were conflicted, sweaty, stuttering, and deeply tortured by their actions over the course of an hour. Real-world war criminals often act with chilling conviction, pride, and bureaucratic efficiency over the course of months or years.
That distinction is paramount. Milgram's experiment isolates one specific variable, which is the staggering power of immediate situational authority to override our short-term moral objections. It beautifully illuminates how easily ordinary, decent people can be pushed to inflict harm in a localized setting. But it falls short of explaining the complex, systemic, and deeply ideological machinery required to mobilize a society to execute a genocide. Which is an incredibly important historical distinction to make. But if we synthesize all of this data, the original baseline, the variations, the archival flaws, and the modern replications, the everyday implications are what really keep me up at night. Because this isn't just about massive historical events or war crimes. This is about the quiet, mundane obedience we participate in every single day. It's about corporate whistleblowers who see their company dumping toxic chemicals into a river but say nothing because the CEO and the legal team signed off on the initiative. It's about junior airline co-pilots who realize the senior captain is making a fatal navigational error, but don't grab the controls because challenging the hierarchy in the cockpit goes against their training.
It is about toxic workplace cultures where abusive, predatory behavior is normalized because that's just how the boss operates, and everyone else in the office just falls in line, quietly becoming complicit agents in the harassment to protect their own paychecks.
It is about how easily, how terrifyingly easily, we let a uniform, a job title, a diploma on a wall, or a corporate mandate overwrite our internal moral compass. We outsource our conscience to the person with the highest salary or the loudest, most confident voice in the room, simply because it is psychologically easier than standing up and saying no.
Milgram held up a very dark, very uncomfortable mirror to society. He forced us to realize that our morality is not a fixed internal absolute. It is highly conditional. Our willingness to do the right thing is deeply, dangerously dependent on the social structure surrounding us at any given moment.
And that leaves us with a chilling paradox, a final thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. From the moment we are born, we are conditioned to exist within these structures. We teach our children to obey their teachers without question. We teach employees to obey their bosses to keep the economy moving. We teach citizens to obey the law and respect police officers to maintain public safety. Obedience is, fundamentally, the glue that holds human civilization together. It is how we build cities, coordinate global supply chains, cure diseases, and maintain order.
Without obedience, you don't have civilization. You have absolute, fractured anarchy.
But this deep dive reveals the dark, inescapable side of that exact same coin. The psychological mechanism that stops us from experiencing chaos in the streets, the same instinct that allows society to function smoothly, is the exact same mechanism that allows an ordinary, decent person, a postal clerk, a nurse, maybe you, maybe me, to sit down in a chair, press a button, and deliver 450 volts of electricity to a screaming stranger just because a man in a gray coat calmly said so. So ask yourself, does obedience protect civilization or quietly endanger it? Milgram showed what happens when people obey authority. The next experiment asked an even darker question. What happens when ordinary people are given authority?